Well, on today's show, we're going to talk about something I have never addressed on the show before, and that is the transcendental argument for God's existence. Basically, showing that God exists based on the existence and reality of the laws of logic. And so that's what we're going to get into. And I think that's what's fun about going through this book right here, Why There Is No God, Simple Responses to 20 Common Arguments for the Existence of God by Atheist Armin Navabi, founder of Atheist Republic. The fun part is just walking through this chapter by chapter is that he addresses things that I don't normally address, things that don't normally come up in conversations that I have or in studies that I've done. And so this transcendental argument for God is not one of the popular arguments for God's existence. And so it doesn't come up a ton. And so I haven't talked about it. But hey, it showed up in chapter 14. And so here we are having a conversation on this argument. It's going to be fun today. As always, I'm going to walk through what the argument is, hopefully break it down, explain it, walk through Armin Navabi's objections to it, evaluate those objections, think through this well, and then take your questions and your calls. And so hopefully it's going to be fun today, and hopefully it's something that is enjoyable to you and interesting to you is how do the laws of logic point to the existence of God. My name is Ryan Pauly. This is the show Think Well, the show created to help you think well about the Christian faith and about the culture so that we can engage well, that we can think about different opinions and people's views differently and hear things that are different than maybe what we were taught or that what we grew up with, to then be able to interact well with ideas that are different. And so anyways, that's why I love your calls, your comments, walking through this book. Hopefully it leads to better conversations among Christians and atheists. That is my hope, and that is my goal. So with that, let me kind of jump in a little bit actually to what this argument is, and then we're going to look at Armin Navabi's objections to it. Now, Armin talks about here at the very beginning of chapter 14, titled The Laws of Logic Prove the Existence of God. And he talks about how this is kind of a new counter argument. It's not necessarily new. It's been in existence for a while, but it was really kind of popularized by Matt Slick from the Christian Apologetics Research Ministry, or CARM.org. And Matt Slick's article that I'm going to pull up and show you here in just a little bit was written back in 2008. And so this is when he published this article, at least kind of walking through the transcendental argument for the existence of God, and kind of popularized this. And we're going to be evaluating and looking at his version of it. Now, what's interesting is that Armin in his chapter, and even after kind of reading this and going, okay, I'm not super familiar with this argument, and I started looking at watching different debates and different discussions. I watched atheist videos disproving and objecting to it, as well as watch videos from Matt Slick explaining it and responding to objections. I kind of found a lot of atheists agreeing with much of this argument. In fact, even Armin agrees and says, look, this argument in the way that it is structured flows logically. Now, he disagrees with the some of the premises, so he does not think it's sound, but he does think that it is a logical, structured, at least, argument. Other atheists will grant other parts of it as well. And so let me actually pull up the website here with Matt Slick's article and kind of walk through this a little bit. So the transcendental argument for God's existence, as he says here at the beginning, is an argument used that attempts to demonstrate the existence of God using the laws of logic. And so the laws of logic that he kind of breaks down are these three main laws. The law of identity, which we actually talked about a lot last week, which is that something is what it is, and it's not what it's not. If it has a specific nature, that's what it is. For example, a cloud is a cloud is not a rock. Or a fish is not a car. And this came up in the conversation that we had last week discussing the existence of the mind. And we used the law of identity to say that if the mind and the brain are the same thing, if they are identical, then what is true of the brain should also be true of the mind. If what is true of the brain is not true of the mind, then they do not share the identity relationship, and therefore the law of identity shows that they are not the same thing. And so we talked about, for example, brain states cannot be true or false. You can't say the molecule of your brain is false, but you can say a thought in the mind is true or false, and therefore the thought cannot be identical to the brain. So that's kind of how this came up in a conversation last week. And one of the laws of logic that Matt Slick is pointing to when he talks about these logical absolutes. The second would be the law of non-contradiction. And this is that something cannot be both true and false at the same time in the same sense. So the common example that I often give to students when I'm speaking is the statement, the earth is round. It cannot be round and a square at the same time in the same sense. This violates the law of non-contradiction. Now, the law of non-contradiction does not tell you what is true, but if you have understanding of what truth is, anything that then contradicts it by definition is false. And so if you can prove that the earth is round, to say it's a triangle, or to say it's flat, or to say it is a square, or to say it's any other shape would be false because it violates here the law of non-contradiction. The third logical absolute that is pointed to here is the law of excluded middle. And this is saying that a statement is either true or false without a middle ground. Now, not all statements are like this. There's kind of multiple different options, but this idea of I'm either alive or I'm dead, right? It's either true or false. You're pregnant is either a true or false statement. And so there is this idea of the law of the excluded middle. There's not a middle option that what we are talking about here. And so you recognize that you have this either or statement. If the statement is false, it's not a valid statement, since it then is self-refuting, as he talks about there in that next point, in that note. And so these are the logical absolutes that he is talking about. These three: the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of the excluded middle. Now, if I can kind of jump a little bit to his conclusion, and then I'm going to walk back. So if you go all the way down, this is a very long article as he goes through a ton of objections. Here's kind of the summary, if you can put it that way. And Travis, good to see you here. Anyways, we'll chat with you. So I didn't see questions. That's why I said it that way. He says, there's only two options. He says, if we have only two possible options by which we can explain something, and one of those options is removed, by default, the other option is verified, since it's impossible to negate both of the only two existing options. So for example, not everything is a true dichotomy, right? It's like, well, what color is the skateboard? It's either blue or red. Well, that's not a true dichotomy because it could be white or black or yellow or pink or any other color. But there are actual true dichotomies. I am alive or dead, right? And so you can use a logical argument to show that I am alive or dead, right? There's this either or option. I'm either alive or I'm dead. I am not dead. Therefore, I am alive, right? If you can negate the I am dead option, namely I'm speaking, then you can show I'm alive, right? There's other examples. I'm pregnant or I'm not pregnant. And you give evidence that you're not pregnant. Therefore, or you give evidence against the not pregnant or the evidence for pregnant, then the other one follows logically. So two options. If there really are only two options, then this is how it is. And so he says then premise two, either God exists or he does not, right? There is no third option here. Either there's a God or there is no God. There's not another option out there. Now, and so that's his second point here. He then says, if the no God position, or atheism as he defines here, clearly fails to account for the logical absolutes, then it's negated, then the other option is verified. Right? So just like if I said, I either drove to the store or I walked, let's say for whatever reason, for the sake of argument, those are the only two options, and I did not walk, by definition, it logically follows, then I drove. Now, obviously that breaks down because it's not a true dichotomy, but for the sake of argument, trying to just give you an example. So that's what he's saying here, that either there exists a God or there is no God. And if the no God option cannot account for the logical absolutes that we experience and see in our world, then the other option has to therefore be true, which is the God option. And then he says, point 4, atheism cannot account for the necessary preconditions of intelligibility, namely the existence of logical absolutes. Therefore, it is invalidated as a viable option for accounting for them, and the only other option then for is God exists then is validated. So that's kind of his conclusion. And right now I'm just trying to help this argument make sense a little bit, and then I'm going to get to Armin's objections. Now, I think maybe this is one reason why this argument is not as popular, is that sometimes when you get into these really logical discussions and talking about the laws of logic, it can become confusing. But I do think there's a way to kind of break this down and make sense of it in a way that starts to make more sense. And so that's what I want to take a few minutes to do here and try to break this down for you, and then get into Armin's objections. And then I'll come back to the live chat. James, good to see you there. And so we're going to come back to that. Now, Travis, let me say this really quickly. The third option, right? So either there's a God, some sort of God. So either there's polytheism or theism or something. There's some sort of transcendent God out there, whether it's many or one, or there's no God, right? That's where there's no other option, is that there's some sort of transcendent mind out there, or many minds, or there is no transcendent minds. What other kind of third option is there? And that's kind of the point that I think he's making. Okay, now back to the beginning of his argument, and then we'll kind of break down some of these terms and try to get to where he is arguing for. He says here, here's how the argument goes. Logical absolutes exist, right? So these absolutes, the law of excluded middle, the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, they exist. I couldn't find a single video of someone saying that they don't exist, because to say they don't exist is to use the law of non-contradiction and say, well, they can't exist and not exist at the same time. And I'm arguing that they don't exist. And so you're wrong to claim that they do exist. That presupposes or uses the law of non-contradiction in order to do that. And so to understand this law of identity, law of non-contradiction, law of excluded middle, these are kind of a foundation for how we speak and reason and think. And so these absolutely, I think, do exist, and most people are going to recognize that. Now, he then says these logical absolutes are conceptual by nature. They're not dependent on space or time, properties, physical properties, or human nature. They transcend the physical world. They're not dependent on space and time for their validity. All right, the law of non-contradiction was true. Now it's going to be true in the future. It was true 1,000 years ago. It was true whether anything exists or not exists. This is what he kind of means by they are conceptual. They also, he wants to argue here that they are not the product of the physical universe, that these exist in the mind. Why? Because you can't dig in a field and find the law of non-contradiction. It's not a physical thing that you find, and therefore it's not a product of the physical nature. They also, he's going to argue, are not products of the human mind, because minds are not absolute. Minds do contradict. Our minds do think different things. And so if it's just the product of the mind, we should have differences. But these differences are governed by the laws of logic, in a sense. And so they cannot be the product of the mind. And so since these laws are always true everywhere, and they are not dependent on a human mind, since human minds are not absolute, then these laws of logic must be absolutely transcendent and in the mind that is authoring them, therefore the mind of God. Therefore, he says there are only two options to account for something, God or no God, and one of them is negated by default, the other position is validated. Therefore, part of the argument is that the atheist position cannot account for the existence of logical absolutes from its worldview. Now, if I can kind of go over a couple quick definitions, and then I'm going to get to Armin's response. Right, he talks about logical absolutes. They are true statements, right? They exist in the attributes and the nature. A cloud exists and has the attributes of whiteness. This is what it is. A rock is heavy. You're making statements about the truth of these different things. Then he also says that they are the foundation or form a basis for rational discourse. This is what I was just talking about. If logical absolutes are not absolutes, then truth can't be known, because you could say, the rock is white, and I could say the rock is black, and we could both be true. Well, the law of non-contradiction says, well, they can't both be true. But if we just throw these logical absolutes out, then you can say the rock is white and the rock is black at the exact same time, fully, not like half and half. Or you could say I'm alive and I'm dead, and those are both true statements, right? You can't know the truth without this. So this is why they form that foundation. He says if they're not absolutes, then we can't have rational discourse. In order to have rational discourse, we have to be able to give examples and recognize that the opposite or contradiction to those examples is by definition false, and these sort of things. And so there is this rational discourse, or the foundation that these present for us. Now, he then is going to argue here and give examples. And by the way, a link to this article I put in the description below on YouTube, so you can check that out if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're on Instagram, sorry, you only get like half the screen. Head on over to YouTube. Logical absolutes are transcendent. It says they don't depend on space and time. They don't stop being true in a different location. If we travel in a certain direction, the law of non-contradiction doesn't cease to exist or stop being true. They're not dependent on time. If we travel past or future, it doesn't change. They're also not dependent on people. Therefore, if our mind is different, that doesn't also change the law of non-contradiction. Now, the law of non-contradiction is true for you, but not true for someone else. No, if your mind is different, then we can say something is wrong because it contradicts that which is true. And so it can't be the product of a human mind. Therefore, he's going to argue that these are transcendent. Fifthly, he says logical absolutes are not dependent on the material world. As we said a moment ago, they're not found in atoms. They're not found under rocks. You can't weigh them. You can't measure them. You can't photograph them. So therefore, they're not part of the physical universe. They're not something that is found in the universe. Therefore, it is something that is not dependent on the material world. And here's like Matt Dillahunty from the Atheist Call-In show. I just blanked on what the show is actually called. But anyways, he says, yeah, I agree with you in that sense that they're not dependent on the material physical universe. Now, here's where the big disagreement is in a lot of the debates and videos that I saw is this idea of what does it mean that logical absolutes are conceptual by nature? And so what Matt Slick is arguing here is that they exist in the mind, that they are process. Logic is the process of the mind. And the logical absolutes are providing a framework for logical thought and process. And so if logic is a process of the mind, logic is our ability to reason, to conduct reasoning and come to certain conclusions, then we recognize this is a mind-dependent thing. Now, it's not created by the mind. And so your mind does not create them. They transcend our mind, but our mind is needed in order to form thoughts. That is the framework, as it says there, for the logical process. And so they are conceptual by nature. They're not dependent on the physical universe, as we talked about. They are conceptual by nature. Then we have to ask this question, then what is their nature? All right. And this is kind of the challenge that Matt Slick is presenting to an atheist, is to say, okay, if the law of logic is not, if the laws of logic are not physical, you can't go find the law of non-contradiction or the law of identity out there, then what is their nature? What ontologically are they? And so they're either conceptual or they're not conceptual. And this is where he had a huge argument with Matt Dillahunty, is that he would say, Matt Slick would, that is conceptual is a product of the mind, or not conceptual, then it is something physical. Well, the laws of logic are not physical things, and so therefore they are conceptual, and therefore they are a product of the mind. So yeah, again, if they're not conceptual by nature, then what are they? What is true of them? We know what something is and what it's not, and that's what he's trying to argue for here. And so therefore, he says, your thoughts then reflect the mind. A person's thoughts are a product of their mind. A mind that is irrational produces irrational thoughts. A mind that is rational produces rational thoughts. And therefore, it's our mind that has the ability to conceive of and to present these laws of logic. And so that's kind of where he's getting at. Therefore, if you have his argument then, if you have these non-physical laws of logic that transcend the human mind, they are transcendent, they are conceptual, then they must be grounded in something that is also transcendent and is also a mind, namely the mind of God. And so if they are mind dependent, they are products of the mind, they exist in a mind, but it's not just my mind that exists. Yes, when I have a thought, that thought is in my mind, but the law of identity is not just a product of my mind and that I invent it or I create it, but it is something that exists in reality outside of us. Then it has to be dependent on some other mind, namely the mind of God, if it's something that transcends the physical. So that's my best understanding, to try to break it down as simply as I can, Matt Slick's version of this argument, to say, okay, therefore, since the laws of logic do exist, since they are transcendent, they're not dependent on space and time, since they are conceptual and they exist in a mind, then they cannot be frozen or weighed or measured. Therefore, this points to them existing in a transcendent, perfect mind, since these are perfect and are never wrong, and they are absolute, namely the mind of God. And that's how he thinks this argument then points to the existence of God. Hopefully, I think that makes sense. And I see a lot of comments here from Travis, but none of them have a queue, so I don't think they're necessarily questions for me, and I can't just walk through all the comments there. So Travis, if you have a question, put it there in the live chat with a queue, and I know exactly that you're asking that to me. Now let's get to Armin's response. I hope that made sense, everybody. Armin's response. So he breaks down again in this chapter what these things are. So he talks about the transcendental argument, what it actually says, and he talks about these 3 points. He breaks it down here into the 7 points in his book, and he calls it TAG, the Transcendental Argument for God, or TAG. Logical absolutes exist. These laws of logic are conceptual in nature, not physical. They do not exist anywhere in the physical world. Point 3, because these absolutes are conceptual, they must have been conceived in a mind. Point 4, however, these laws are perfect and absolute. Human minds are not perfect or absolute. Point 5, logical absolutes are true everywhere and are not dependent on human minds. 6, therefore, these laws of logic must exist in a perfect, absolute, transcendent mind. 7, namely that mind is called God. And so Armin then comments here, and he says this, quote, put it in another way, logical absolutes must be the product of a mind, and these laws are absolute, so they must be an absolute mind behind them, with that being the mind of God. Now, he talks about this again, in order for this to work, two conditions must be met. The premises must be true, and the structure must support the premises of their logical conclusion. He goes, structurally, Armin writes, the argument is logically sound. If every premise were true, then the outcome would also be true. However, we shall see the premises are not true, which invalidates the argument entirely. Now, Armin's objection to this is namely one big fallacy, the fallacy of equivocation. Now, equivocation is the fallacy where a key term in an argument is changed to then invalidate the argument. So if I said the bat hit the baseball, 500 feet. Well, bats are flying animals that could never hit a baseball 500 feet. Therefore, the bat did not hit the baseball 500 feet. You recognize I'm changing the definition of bat from a baseball bat to the flying animal bat, and therefore I'm invalidating the argument. You go, well, hold on a second. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is the baseball bat, and you changed the key word bat to mean something different to then invalidate the argument. That's probably a terrible example, but that is what kind of a fallacy of equivocation is. And so what Armin is going to argue here is that the problem with TAG, the transcendental argument for God, is that the laws of logic are descriptive, he says, not prescriptive. They are simply describing things that we know to be true, but not prescribing or telling us what should be. He says, for example, gravity is a descriptive law. Isaac Newton did not create it. It existed before he identified it and would have continued existing regardless of whether he had given it a name. The laws of gravity are simply observations made by scientists that explain natural processes. On the other hand, he writes that a traffic speed limit would be something prescriptive. It is something created by us that we prescribe, and now you have to follow it. It is enforced. He then writes this, quote, in the same way, the laws of logic are descriptive. No one made them up or wrote them in a handbook somewhere for them to exist. They were simply observed as always being true. Rocks are always rocks because if a rock were anything else, it would cease to be a rock. Because the laws of logic, he writes, are not prescriptive, they do not require the mind of a deity or any other mind to exist. Human minds can identify them and put them into words, but phenomena these laws refer to would continue to exist regardless of whether a deity or anyone else thought about them. Now, here's what he's trying to say is to say, look, these things would exist no matter what because they are just simply descriptive aspects of reality. Now, that's true. It does describe reality. These laws are describing aspects of reality. But what Armin has not done here is I think that he has missed the whole point of the argument. He's missed the point of the argument. And I'll post this in the description below where a different atheist raises the same objection and Matt Slick responds to it. I think that his response does make sense as I kind of weighed out like the objection, his response, and I was trying to think about it. And I think his objection does make sense in the sense of this. Yes, it describes aspects of reality that you can look at a rock and say, well, the rock is a rock and it's not a rock, so to speak. But the question is, these descriptions, these laws of logic do exist. How do you account for them? Not the fact, yes, they're used to describe things and they're used to make sense of reality around us. They do reflect reality, but the atheist, when making this argument, presupposes or just assumes, yes, these logical absolutes do exist and they just describe reality. And you go, yes, I get that they do exist. We all recognize that these logical absolutes exist. The question is, can you account for them? How do you make sense of transcendent, conceptual, absolute laws in a purely materialistic universe? That's the question. Not whether they do reflect reality. That's true. We recognize they do reflect reality, but we recognize that these laws are only products of the mind. Therefore, if there is no transcendent mind, how can you ground or explain or give a justification for these transcendent conceptual laws of logic? Does that make sense? And so to say, well, no, he just commits this fallacy of equivocation because they're just descriptive. Yes, they do describe. But the question is, if they exist, how do you account for their existence? Right? I don't know. Maybe I just thought of this on the spot, and maybe it's a terrible argument or analogy, but it's like, well, a ruler just measures something. Yes, but how do you just explain the existence of the ruler? Well, rulers just measure stuff. That's true. Rulers do measure stuff, but how do you explain how the ruler came to be? Right? And then you can say, well, the ruler is created out of a piece of wood, blah, 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 whatever. But I think the mistake that's happening here is to say, well, hey, these laws of logic, they're not prescriptive. They're only descriptive. They describe reality. Therefore, we're good. And it's like, well, no, that doesn't dismiss the question, because you're just assuming, yes, these laws do exist. You presuppose their existence and therefore say, what's the problem? They exist. They describe reality. We're good. And it's like, no, but the very nature of this argument is to say, how do you make sense of, or how do you ground these arguments? If they're not in a transcendent, absolute mind, how do you ground these arguments? What are they? If they're not physical, if they're not dependent on space and time, if they're transcendent, then how do you make sense of these within an atheistic, no God world, if that makes sense? And so he says, look, Armin goes on, he says, minds are necessary only to describe the phenomenon, not make it true. Yes, that is true. Minds do describe it. And these laws, though, that are in our minds, that are concepts in the minds, how do we make sense of those? That's the big question that Matt Slick is trying to get at, which I think is a really fascinating question. Now, again, if you haven't told, this is kind of a, I don't know if I'm making sense. This is a confusing argument. Maybe it's all making sense. And you're like, Ryan, why do you keep saying this? But I think this is why often this is maybe not the most popular argument for God, is it can be more confusing. And so here, Armin says this again, and then I'll jump back over to the live chat, and I'm getting close to being done at 27 minutes. The fallacy of equivocation occurs, Armin writes, because the tag argument uses logical absolutes in more than one sense. He says logical absolutes are described in step 1 of the tag argument above. They are physical underpinnings of the universe. So that's not true. I watch a ton of Matt Slick stuff on this. He says, no, they are not physical. He says the logical absolutes, namely, what are they? The law of identity, the law of excluded middle, and the law of non-contradiction. So he's not using logical absolutes in the first step to describe physical underpinnings of the universe. He's talking about transcendent conceptual laws of logic. So I don't think that is true. He then says in step 2, they are descriptions of those laws, like a photograph described earlier. Logical absolutes do exist, he writes. However, these laws are not conceptual in nature. We do not need any minds for them to exist. So that's the question. He makes this statement and then he just kind of ends it there. He says logical absolutes do exist, but they are not conceptual. And so the challenge or pushback that I would have for Armin Navabi here would be like, okay, if you're saying they do exist and they are not conceptual, then where are they? What are they? What is the law of identity if it is not conceptual in nature, but you're saying it absolutely does exist? Because if it's not conceptual in nature, I agree with Matt Slick, then therefore it would have to be something physical. If it's not an immaterial, non-physical thing, then it has to be a physical thing. There's only 2 options. Now, Matt Dillahunty and Matt Dillahunty is another atheist, and Matt Slick's debate with him on the Atheist Experience, that's the name of his show. He says, okay, so Matt Slick challenged Matt Dillahunty on this and said, okay, if it's not non-physical, conceptual, and you're saying, but you're saying it's not physical. And Matt Dillahunty said, it's not physical. And he goes, and it's not conceptual. Then what is it? And he goes, well, I don't know. It could be something else. And Matt Slick goes, what is it? Can you give me a third option? And Matt Dillahunty, in a sense, said, I don't know what it is, but I'm saying it's neither of those. And this is where you kind of have this struggle where it's hard. And what came to mind as I was listening to that debate is to say, like, look, here's a true dichotomy. I'm either alive or dead. And if someone goes, no, you're neither. What do you mean I'm neither? Well, there's another option. What is it? I don't know. But I don't think you're alive and I don't think you're dead. There's another option. Well, what is that other option? Well, I don't know what it is, but why aren't you okay with just saying, I don't know? That's what Matt Dillahunty said. Why aren't you Christians just okay with saying, I don't know, we'll figure it out one day? And Matt Slick's response, and I agree with, was to say, well, no, in order for you to show that my true dichotomy, I'm alive or dead, is a false dichotomy, that there's another option out there, is that you have to give me another option. If we don't know of any other option, and there is reason to believe that these are the only two options, and you can't show me a third, then I have good reason to say that these are the two options, and therefore it's a true dichotomy. I don't have to prove against every other non-option. I'm saying that I'm either alive or I'm dead. And if you're going to disagree and say, well, I think there's another option, but you don't know what that other option is, I think you have the burden of proof to give that other option. And so I think there's a similarity here to say, look, these laws of logic are either non-physical, conceptual in nature, or they are physical. And so for Armin to respond and say, yes, they absolutely, laws of logic absolutely do exist, but they are not conceptual, then the question is, then what are they? Are they physical? Where are they? If they are physical, where are they? Where do you find them? Well, if they're not physical, then they're conceptual. It seems like the other only two options. If there's another option, what is it? And so that's where I think that this objection doesn't quite go through, where I don't think it actually hits the core of the argument, which is to ground and make sense of these logical absolutes. All right. The last flaw that Armin says about here, and I'm like 2 minutes away from being done, and then I'll jump over to the comment section. And if anyone wants to call in, I'd be happy to chat with you. He says the other flaw of the transcendental argument is that there's nothing to suggest what that mind might be. In other words, the transcendent mind behind the rules of logic wouldn't necessarily need to have the qualities commonly associated with a deity, including benevolence, omnipotence, a role of creation of the universe, or the source of morality. As such, it would fail to actually prove anything about the existence of deities or provide convincing reason to worship or attempt to create personal relationships with God. Now, that's true in one sense, but here's where I think this is often a misunderstanding with the arguments for God's existence, is that each argument does not stand alone as a proof of the Christian God. This is commonly objected to with the cosmological argument, to say that whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And you say, see, the universe has a cause. You go, but you can't prove that's a Christian God. Well, the argument isn't to prove that the Christian God exists necessarily. It's to prove that there is a transcendent cause of the universe. And therefore, there is something outside of the universe that caused it to come into existence, and then we can start to figure out what that is. I don't think this argument, the transcendental argument, is to show that the Christian God is true. It is to show that there is some sort of absolute transcendent mind outside that transcends our physical universe. That would at least negate or prove that atheism, in a sense, is false. This says that there is no mind, non-physical reality outside of our universe. The physical universe is really all that there is for the atheists that kind of hold to a physicalism view. Now, again, the question then follows is, well, what is that mind? And there's other arguments for it. Now, again, it's kind of like in a murder trial to say, well, just because you have a fingerprint doesn't prove that, he is the murderer. Of course not. Just the simple fingerprint at the crime scene doesn't prove that he murdered them, but it proves that he was there. Now we have other arguments, and it's a cumulative case. All of them come together to show why this person is guilty. But if you break each one down individually and say, well, but the fact that a gun is at the scene doesn't show that he shot the gun. Well, that's true. Just the fact that his fingerprint was at the scene doesn't show that he shot the gun. It's like, well, that's true. But you put all the pieces together and you get a complete picture of who it is. And so I think to object to the transcendental argument for God's existence by saying, well, even if this does prove that there's some sort of transcendent mind that beyond the universe that is the grounding of the rules of logic, that isn't proof it's the Christian God. Well, yeah, it's not necessarily the Christian God, but it is a more theistic conclusion that there is a mind that transcends the universe that grounds these laws than an atheistic position that says, I don't really think there's a mind, or I don't know if there's a mind, or there is no mind. You now do have this sort of transcendent mind. So anyways, I know there's other objections. I'm not going to go through every objection. Those are at least Armin Navabi's objections on why he thinks this argument that says that the laws of logic prove the existence of God is not good, and why I think it's at least interesting to consider and to think through. So the next time I'm going to jump into this book, chapter 15, is that believing in God provides meaning and purpose, and without it, life would be meaningless. And so we're going to talk about the purpose of life and the meaning of life and how that makes sense within an atheist versus a theist or Christian perspective. And so that's going to be the next show together. So with that, let me jump over here to the questions. I don't see any on Instagram. Instagram people, where you at? All right. Travis, a lot has come in from you. And so let me walk back through some of these and see where you put a Q. And again, if anyone wants to call in, you can click on the link there on YouTube and call in and have a conversation with you, with me. I'm sorry, I'm trying to read comments right now and talk at the same time. Question, can you replace, here we go. I can't pull it up. Let's see. Let's see, where is it? Question, here we go. Can you replace logical absolutes with God beliefs and reread Slick's site? So I'm not going to go back over all of Slick's sites, but the question is, God beliefs, is true that some people have beliefs about God, other people don't have beliefs about God, but virtually everyone recognizes that logical absolutes exist. And if you deny the existence of logical absolutes, you have to use them to deny them. And so I think that when we're talking about logical absolutes, what Slick is doing is that he is starting from a point of agreement where everyone will say, yes, I agree with logical absolutes, law of identity, law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle. Those things are real. Now, then the question is, how does each view make sense of that? How does each view ground those sort of beliefs? And so I think that's what he's trying to go at with there. How do you make sense of a transcendent dimension to reality when you can't interpret physical evidence? So I'm not sure what you mean there, Travis, is when you can't interpret physical evidence. But the whole point is this. If we have things in our physical universe that point to something external to the universe, then we can start to point to or allude to a transcendent reality. And again, J. Warner Wallace, a crime scene detective, he puts it this way: is like, hey, if I have physical evidence in a universe or in a room of a dead body, there are ways of explaining that dead body by staying in the room. And so if they just simply died, and maybe you could see that they hit their head on something and fell over, or that they, ingested something that was poisonous, whatever, maybe not poisonous, but anyways, a heart attack, you can say, okay, we can stay in the room and we can explain this. But if you walk into a room and you find a dead body that's got 10 bullet holes or 10 knife marks in their back, then that evidence points to a cause that is outside the room, namely a murderer who came in the room, committed murder, and now is gone, has left that room. And so you're now going to leave that room searching for something external, because the evidence is saying what happened here cannot be explained here. Something else is an explanation that has left the room. And so he kind of uses that same logical, or that same argument, to point to evidence inside of our universe. If we have evidence in our universe that can be perfectly explained by staying within our universe, then there's no need to point to anything transcendent. But if we have evidence like laws of logic, consciousness, the beginning of a universe, these sort of things, objective morality, and designing and fine-tuning of our universe, all these different arguments for God, each one saying, look, this is something that points to something external, namely a fine-tuner, a designer, a cause, a mind, that then is saying, look, we are making sense of some sort of transcendent being or transcendent reality by looking and interpreting the physical evidence in front of us. We are looking at the fact of how we reason, of how we logic, and how do we make sense of the world around us. Now, again, this is why it's not God of the gaps. And I feel like maybe I should just stop addressing this point, because it comes up all the time. God of the gaps is, I don't know, therefore God. But that is not clearly what we're saying. Is what do we know? We know that logical absolutes exist. We know that logical absolutes are transcendent. We know that logical absolutes are conceptual. Therefore, they exist in a mind, And there then has to be a mind outside of. It's like saying, well, I found a dead body with 10 holes in their back and a bunch of casings on the ground. That must have been a murderer. And it's like, well, murder of the gaps. It's like, no, I'm not saying I don't know how they died, therefore murder. It's saying based on what I do see, based on what I'm aware of in reality in front of me, this points to a certain conclusion. And so I think that's what's going on here. Travis, a lot of comments here. Again, I'm not seeing anyone else commenting, so I'm just kind of walking through what Travis put in the comment section. So thanks a lot, Travis. And again, if you want to call in, call in. Ryan, do you agree Matt Slick is making a God of the gaps argument? So no, I don't think so. And that's why. He is not saying, I don't know how to make sense of logical absolutes, therefore God. He's saying based on what we know is true of logical absolutes, there is only one conclusion. And based on the law of excluded middle, based on the law of non-contradiction, you have either God or not God as an explanation. The not God explanation does not work in a materialistic, physical only universe. You cannot make sense of and ground these logical absolutes. Therefore, the God explanation is true. And just like saying, okay, if I find a dead body with 10 holes in their back, you cannot make sense of that by saying death by natural causes. There is no natural cause. And you go, well, what if there was a natural cause that put holes in their back? Okay, but can you point me to that natural cause? No, we just haven't discovered it yet. Okay, until you can give me good reason to believe that someone can just get holes in their back by natural causes, this is best explained by a murderer. And so that's not a murder of the gaps in the same way I don't think that Slick here is making a God of the gaps. It's saying, look, based on everything that we know, and the fact that a physical material universe cannot ground or make sense of transcendent conceptual logical absolutes, therefore the no God option is negated, and therefore the God option does make the best sense. And so I don't think Slick there is making a God of the gaps argument. So Travis, you said, okay, an atheist believes that the logical absolutes are not physical. Okay, so if they are not physical, do they actually exist? And so if they do exist and they're not physical, then you are now granting the existence of a non-physical reality, which I thought you disagreed with based on other conversations. Maybe I'm wrong there. And so now we have a non-physical reality that really does exist, that is true. And so the question is now, within an atheistic framework, an atheistic worldview that says there is no God, how do we ground transcendent, absolute, these conceptual things? All right. Other questions. Okay, this one you say is a question. Are you agreeing that the Bible's miracles are impossible considering you believe in the laws of logic? No. So if we were on the phone, my challenge back to you would say, how do miracles contradict the laws of logic? Which law of logic does a miracle or which law of logic does a miracle break, right? And miracles would go against what we know physically, how things physically operate on a normal day-to-day basis, but there is no logical impossibility of a miracle. There is no law of logic that it breaks. And so my challenge back to you would say, if you're going to say that Bible's miracles are impossible considering the laws of logic, which law of logic does a miracle violate? And I'll scroll down to the bottom to see if you jump in here in just a moment. But it doesn't violate any law of logic. The point is, you say there, if it doesn't break a law of logic, is it even a miracle? It's just natural. No, that would be a false dichotomy. You're something happening naturally, and then there's something you can happen supernaturally. Right. And so we're saying naturally people don't. So let's just take Jesus resurrection from the dead. There's no law of logic that breaks. It's not illogical. It just naturally speaking, dead bodies don't come back from the dead. So if Jesus did come back from the dead, then you're not going to have a natural explanation because there is no natural explanation for that. Instead, you have God raised him from the dead. Now, a stupid, simple analogy for this is to say, look, if there's an external greater power, so to speak, then it can allow you to do things that would not naturally take place. So I heard a person once say, I can get my child to walk on water. Well, naturally, by themselves, a child is not going to walk on water. They put their feet on top of the water and they're going to sink. How can you get a kid to walk on water? Well, I can walk next to the pool holding my son's hands to where his feet barely touch the water. If you have an external force outside of my child who is more powerful, then I can get my child to, in a sense, do things that he could not do naturally, namely walk on water. Now, it's a silly, stupid example, but it's trying to show the point that you naturally cannot just walk on water, but there's also no law of logic that's broken by an external, more powerful force allowing my son to do something that he would not be able to do on his own, namely walk on water. So the same thing is true here. If God does exist, right? If there's no God, then there is no supernatural, then you have no miracles, because you can't have a supernatural miracle if there is no supernatural. But if you do have a God who is an all-powerful being, and if Jesus dies, naturally, dead bodies don't come back from the dead. We recognize that. People die, they stay dead. But if God does exist and he can cause that body to come back to life, you now have a supernatural miracle that is possible, but does not violate any sort of laws of logic. And so believing in laws of logic does not violate or disprove or show the impossibility of any biblical miracles. All right. So Travis, I saw a lot more questions that you came in, but there are other questions from other people. So let me jump down to John. Let me come back. Let me star this just so I don't miss it for later. Let's see here. So John says, how would you respond to someone saying God is evil or bad because he murdered children in the Great Flood? This is a great question. This just came in on a different comment or a different video I had. So there's a few different ways I think that we have to think through this. And the first thing is this. Is God, or let me put it this way. Can God murder? The question is, what is murder? How are we defining it, right? So the question is, and I would define murder as the unjustified taking of innocent human life, right? That you don't have a justification and therefore you take innocent human life. And so if I walk up to someone on the road and just kill them because I just want to, right? You would go, that's not a good justification for just killing people. That is murder. And I would get charged for murder. That's why we don't call, generally speaking, killing in war murder, because it's justified. You're committing a war. Now, there can be murder and people can have unjustified killings in war. But generally speaking, if people are shooting at you and you shoot back, self-defense, we don't consider that murder because you are defending yourself. There's a justification. So the question is this: can God have unjustified taking of innocent human life? Can God murder? Now, here's a stupid example, but I would use it with my students in my classroom all the time, and I think it gets the point across. Take, for example, the guitar on the wall behind me. If you're watching on YouTube, there's a guitar sitting on my wall behind me. Can you come in my room and just take that guitar off my wall and smash it on the ground? Well, yes, you could. Would it be okay to do? No. Why not? It's not yours. That is not your guitar to take off the wall and smash. So if you just walked into my house, took my guitar off the wall, and just started smashing it on the floor, you would be wrong because it's not yours. Now, what if I decided to take my guitar off the wall and smash it on the ground? Would I be okay? Would it be okay for me to do that? Yes. What's the difference? Well, for you, that guitar is not yours. For me, it is mine. And since it is my guitar, I can do whatever I want with it. And I don't have to give a reason for what I'm doing with it because it's my guitar and I can do whatever I want with it. And so it's not wrong for me to smash it where it would be wrong for you to smash it. In a similar sense, if God is the creator of our life, if he owns us, as 1 Corinthians 6 talks about, if he is the creator and sustainer of everything, as Colossians 1 talks about, and Genesis 1 and John 1, then we recognize that God stands in a different position than we do as the creator and sustainer of all things. Scripture talks about that he is the author of life, that he can give and to take away. And so if he chooses to take away life, can that be murder if it's his life to give and take away? Just like if I choose to smash it, can that be wrong because it's my guitar to do what I want with? It's wrong for you to do, it's not yours. So that life that I would be taking unjustly is murder because that's not my life to take. But if God does it, can he murder? Now, I think that at least starts to make sense of the first part of, can God murder? And I don't think God can. There's a lot of things that we can do and not do. So I just watched, I love cop videos. I just watched a video of a cyclist almost being hit by a car and then going and confronting the driver. And then the cyclist got a ticket for disorderly conduct because he confronted and detained the driver and wouldn't let him leave. When the cop showed up, the cop said, "You can't do that. You're not a cop. I can do that." So we recognize there's a difference of authority where he's saying to the cyclist, you can't detain people, and the fact that you did detain them is a crime. But I can detain them, and it's not a crime. Why? Because I am authority in this position, and you're not. I think a similar type of reasoning can be used when we talk about God, is that God, as the ultimate authority, as the author and creator and giver of life, has the ability to give and to take away. And so it's not murder in that sense as it would be for us. Now, the question then becomes, why did God do this? Did he also have a reason? And we recognize with the flood, we see over and over in scripture before Genesis that their thoughts were evil all the time, that he was destroying the wickedness that had consumed the world. And so this is a punishment. Now, you may or may not disagree with something like a death penalty, but if you have someone who has murdered, now again, this is not the children, we'll get to that in a second. If you have someone who has committed mass genocide, take a evil dictator, a Hitler, whatever you want to do, some person that has killed 200 people, just murder them in cold blood, and give them, is it wrong to give that person the death penalty? And we would often, many people would say, well, no, maybe I'm not for the death penalty, but they do deserve something. They are wicked. And so we recognize God's judgment against wicked people is not murder. In the similar way, when you give the death penalty to a convicted felon, you're not murdering them, you're killing them, but you have a justification for it. It's because they've gone off and killed other people. Lastly, I think you get with the children, and this is similar to killing the Canaanites. And again, this is very logical, but the question is, what is God doing at that time? And if you are like most Christian theologians that hold to children going to heaven before the age of accountability, if they are not actually guilty and deserving of that punishment, and they go to heaven, then God was actually granting salvation to these kids that otherwise would have probably grown up into a wicked culture and been punished and deserve that punishment themselves. And so there's a lot more to go into this, but I see my comment section just going crazy on the side. And so I want to kind of walk through the different questions and objections that come in. But I think those are at least a few starting points to think through this question of why I don't think, or my response to why I don't think that God is evil or bad because children died in the Great Flood, if that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense a little bit. All right, let me keep kind of going through this as quickly as I can. Again, put a Q if you're writing in the live chat, put a Q before it. So I know that you're actually talking to me, or tag me in it. Let's see. All right, here's another one from John. Ryan, how would you respond to someone saying God is, oh, that's the same one. Okay. All right, here's another one from John. That's the third one. All right, John, you keep posting the same question. I just see a Q and I click on it. All right, I'm seeing mostly you guys all talking, and I'm not seeing more questions that came in. All right, here's a question from Travis. Why did God create the world that he knew would become evil? So this is, I think, a really good question in the sense of, yes, God knew it would become evil. So why create? Well, what is the other option? To not create at all? Well, then what God is doing is recognizing, I think, that he creates. Why? So that people can choose to be in a loving, committed relationship with him. And to create a world in which never goes evil, I think would have to be creating a world in which has no free will, where you cannot create free creatures and then not allow them to use their freedom wrongly. And so I think a world in which people exist and where people can freely enter into a loving relationship with God that is only a benefit to us, not to him, is a better world than no world at all. Could God have just existed within the nature of the Trinity eternally and been content? Yes. Did he need us? No. Do we make him better? No. But he created for our benefit, that we can choose to be with him and enjoy him forever. And I think that is a better world than creating no world at all, even though he knew that it would become evil. And I think that's kind of what we recognize in Scripture. Let's see here. All right, here is another question from John. Are there people who you would just not bother arguing with? People who are obviously not arguing in good faith? Yes, absolutely. Now, I think that how I wanted to say this is there's different areas or avenues or platforms. If I'm just having a personal one-on-one conversation, maybe through text or something like that, maybe there's a point where I'm like, okay, where is this going? Right? It doesn't seem like you're arguing in good faith. Like, help me understand, like, are you really being serious here? And if it just shows that they are not being serious and they're like, I don't care what you say, I'm not going to talk about it, or I'm not going to accept whatever you say, nothing will change my mind, then I'm probably going to stop. Now, if they're a friend, I'm going to keep hanging out with them, maybe bring stuff up here and there and like just see kind of where that goes, but I'm really going to kind of drop it. And I've had people tell me this. Like, I had a student once that said, if you could prove to me that God exists, I wouldn't even believe in him. And so then the question's like, well, then why would I ever sit here and try to prove to you that God exists? Even if I could prove to you that he exists, you wouldn't believe. That seems ridiculous on my part to keep trying. And so I think there's an aspect on, if it's a personal thing, maybe not. If it's a relationship, I'm going to keep the relationship going. However, I do see a value here sometimes on YouTube where people that want to call in, I let call in, because even if maybe they are not arguing in good faith, I think it can show as an example to all of you who are listening and watching. I think that you can either see, wow, maybe you think this about me, or you think about people that I talk to, like, wow, like that's the length that you have to go to deny what is being said. Like, you really got to just say, no, whatever. And that's how you have to argue in order to deny what is just obviously true, right? Again, maybe you think that about me, maybe you think that about guests, but I think that it can be instructive for others. I think that it can also be instructive for others of you trying to figure out, how do I have a conversation with someone who is not arguing in good faith? How do I go about trying to ask good questions and respond and present and challenge and cause them to think when it doesn't really show that they want to or care to think? And so I do continue to find a benefit or a reason to engage with people on more of a public platform, because while I may not convince the person I'm talking to, I recognize that there are others, right? It's called, like, some people call it like evangelism by deflection or something like that, like a reflect evangelism or whatever, I forget. But anyways, it's the idea of like, you're trying to talk to this person, but it's just bouncing off them, but it's hitting a bunch of people who are around listening. And so I think that sometimes we have to just take a awareness of our surroundings, and to think through, where am I? Who is this? Who is listening? Where is the benefit? And continue that on. And I think sometimes we need to focus on relationships. And there's times where I've told Mormon missionaries, look, I'm not here to argue with you. I want to get to know you. And through relationships, because they care about theological things and I care about theological things, those things just kind of naturally come up. And so the question is, am I just trying to be friends? Am I only in a relationship because I'm trying to prove you right or prove you wrong and I'm trying to argue with you? Or is there a deeper relationship there where we can say, hey, let's be friends and we can talk as we talk? But yeah, there are times where if it's on like Twitter or something in comment sections where I just go, okay, I'm done. You can have the last word. Now, comment sections is kind of different because, hey, other people can see that. And I have had people respond to comment sections, go, wow, that was really informative of how you walk through that argument. So all that to say, I think it really does depend on kind of the situation and how I want to go about this sort of conversation. All right. Travis, I think you asked me a question. Do I think people that lack faith can argue in good faith? We're going to have a conversation about what faith means here in a little bit. All right, I don't know how I missed that. So Travis had written in here, if God has justifications to murder, anyone could claim that God told them they had justifications to murder and we wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So yeah, I don't think, to be very clear, I don't think I can just say, God told me to do it, and therefore he did it. What it was asked about was the flood. That was clearly not someone just killing in the name of God. That was clearly a God event. There's no one that just dumped a bunch of buckets on the water and drowned the entire, committed the great flood. And so what we have to think through here is no, I don't think you can just say, well, God told me to kill you. That's not a good reason. We actually have to have better reasons for why we do what we do. So anyways, I am at an hour, which is generally my allotted time. If there's anyone else that has one final question, if you want to call in really quickly, I technically can go for about 30 more minutes. But otherwise, if there's nothing else, then I am going to sign off. Let me just say this. You want to hear my too long didn't read on the flood? What? I don't know what's you're referring to, if that was me or someone else. Again, this is the next book that I requested from Crossway. What do I say when? A Parent's Guide to Navigating Cultural Chaos for Children and Teens. We're going to kind of walk through that chapter by chapter and look at how do we respond to different cultural issues. That should be fun. If that's something that you're interested in, then you can subscribe, like the show, follow, and kind of get what's coming up next. Again, the next chapter from Armin Navabi is going to be believing God provides meaning and purpose. Without it, life would be meaningless. If you're curious, the last 5 chapters that we have to cover here, chapter 16, so many people died for God and religion, therefore it must be real. Chapter 17, atheism has killed more people than religion, so it must be wrong. Chapter 18, you'll become a believer when you are desperate for God's help. Chapter 19, smart people and renowned scientists like X, Y, and Z believe in God, so it must be true. And then chapter 20, how can we really know anything? And so that kind of will wrap up this book, walking through the 20 reasons or 20 responses to why there is no God. And then also I have a series on natural theology I want to get to, as well as I have some comments that came in. So for example, I had a Jehovah's Witness comment in to try to show that Jesus is not God. And I said, hey, are you willing for a private or public conversation? And the person said, no, I'm not. And so, hey, maybe I'll just kind of walk through what they said there with you and kind of walk through arguments for Jesus, why he's God and the Trinity. And so anyways, a lot of fun stuff coming up, I think, that should be good. John asks, if I have any thoughts on the book, Jesus Calling? I don't. I've heard a lot about it, but I can't remember what I've heard. So I'm not going to be able to speak into that one. And then last question here from Travis, and then I'll have to end. Like, why is it local? Oh, Travis, why is it local compared to global? And why is it not a copied Sumerian story despite many literary coincidences? So with the nature of the flood, here's the way that I would approach it. When I look at scripture and things that overlap with science, nature, I'm trying to figure out how can they be reconciled in this? And the reason for that is that I come at this with a belief that God is the author of scripture and he is the creator of nature. And therefore our study of nature, science, and our study of scripture, our theology, our science and theology should agree. If they don't agree, it means that we're interpreting either nature or scripture incorrectly. And so when I look at things in science that seem to suggest that there was no global flood or that issues with a global flood, it's like, okay, can scripture even allow for that? Can scripture even account for that? And I've done other shows on this topic that go into way more detail. But I think when we look at the Genesis account, where it talks about the flood covering all the earth, that word earth is not necessarily globe, because it talks about there was a famine all over the earth in Exodus. But we also know that the famine in Egypt didn't cover the entire globe. It was the earth is in that region of the globe. And we talk about, all the high mountains were covered. Well, all can mean all is in every single thing on the entire globe, or all is within that region. Just like if you go to a restaurant, you say, I'll eat anything. Not literally anything, you mean anything on the menu. And so I think when you look at the Genesis narrative of the flood, it allows for the possibility of the flood to either be global, or it allows for the possibility of that flood to be local. What was the purpose of the flood? The purpose of the flood is God sent the flood to kill all the people and animals that had been infected by sin. If the sin and the people had not spread over the entire globe, then the flood could have killed all the people and animals affected by sin and not necessarily have to cover the entire globe. And so I think that scripture allows for both of those possibilities, just like I think it allows for, it could be young earth, it could be old earth. I think, when we talk about Revelation, it could be amillennial, it could be premillennial, it could be post-millennial. Like, what is the millennium? Is there Calvinism, Arminianism, Molinism? Like, there's these things that are kind of unclear, and there's multiple Christian options. I think it allows for the possibility that it's either local or global. Both can fit. And so then when you look at the scientific evidence, which seems to suggest that there was not a global flood, but there were local floods, then I think that can line up and make sense of why maybe it is still local. Now, when we look then at the Sumerian stories, I'm writing a training letter on this right now, but here's, I think, the reality is, just because there are similar stories does not mean one is necessarily copied or that the other is by definition false, right? There's a lot of stories you can share that are similar. So for example, think about it like this. If the flood of Genesis of the Bible is true, that every single person on the face of this globe was wiped out, and therefore everyone that now exists comes through Noah and his descendants, then all of the civilizations that would have been created, so to speak, or spread out from Noah and his descendants would have a story of a flood. And so there's going to be, I think that can make sense of how different cultures have different stories of this great flood. If the great flood is true that wiped out all people except for one family and everyone is a descendant of that family, then it would make sense of why each of these different cultures that all came from that one family would have different stories of this sort of great flood. At the same time, we have to recognize that just because stories are similar doesn't mean they're necessarily copied. And also just because some stories are similar doesn't mean others are not true. So a common example for this would be, I could tell you the story of a British-owned ship that made its maiden voyage across the Atlantic, struck an iceberg, and sank, killing the majority of passengers because there weren't enough lifeboats. The big ship was about 800 feet long. There was about 2,500 people on board. I could tell you all these details. You go, oh, that's the Titanic. Well, yeah, that is true of the Titanic, but it's also true of a story called The Futility, the sinking of the Titan, that was written 14 years before the Titanic actually sunk. And it's a made-up novel story. Now, is the fact that it shares so many similarities show that the Titanic event is copied or plagiarized or taken from the book The Futility that was written 14 years prior? No, it just is crazy, but it happened to be that 14 years earlier, someone wrote a story about a ship that sinks that almost perfectly matches the true story of the Titanic. And so just because there are these other stories doesn't mean the true story is false. It also doesn't mean that it's necessarily copied. And so I think that we recognize is that, yes, there are other great flood stories, but that doesn't discredit or prove the flood of the Bible false. I think it makes sense of the flood of the Bible. If everyone is a descendant of Noah and his family, then they would have stories being told throughout, passed along orally of a great flood, but also doesn't show that the story is false, just like the sinking of the Titan does not show the sinking of the Titanic to be false. And so those would be kind of some longer comments on that. I'm looking through really quickly. Okay, so Travis, on the genetic research, I've been reading something on this because I want to do a show on Noah, not Noah, on Adam and Eve. And I was reading some genetic research that shows if the biblical story is true, there are predictions that we can make. Just like in science, you make a prediction, you test that prediction. If the biblical story is true, now I don't know all the genetics behind this and the reasoning for it, but their argument was this, that there is a bottleneck at Noah for the male lineage, right? Because it was male and it's Noah and his 3 sons. And so all male genetics go back to Noah, and that's where the bottleneck is. But Noah had a wife, and his sons all had 3 wives. So there's 4 women who don't bottleneck at Noah, but they have female lineage actually can trace through them. And you can go back further, possibly even to Eve. And so their argument was, if the biblical story is true, when we do the study of genetics in science, we should see the first woman have existing prior to the first man, because genetic wise, if the biblical story is true, we should be able to trace all the way back to Eve, but through the female line, since you have 4 women, the wives, but the male line should bottleneck and stop at Noah. And therefore the male genetics should be a much more recent date than the female genetic that we have for the first woman. And when you look at mitochondrial Eve and chromosomal Adam, you see them existing at different times. Mitochondrial Eve going back further than chromosomal Adam. So the genetics actually does confirm, or at least line up with what we should expect if there was a bottleneck in the genetics, and the research, I think, is showing that. So I want to do a much longer reflection on this in the future, and kind of get to some of your other questions that I see that have come in on this. And so I have reached out to some people, hopefully doing a more scientific approach and look at first humans Adam and Eve? Is there any credibility to the biblical story? So with that, I'm going to have to end the conversation there. Again, next week should be the next part, chapter 15, believing a guide provides meaning and purpose, and without it, life would be meaningless. We're going to talk about that. And until then, as always, a bunch of videos are going to pop up on a ton of different topics. I have like 200 or 300 videos on YouTube, helping you think well about different cultural, social, theological, apologetic issues. So with that, thanks for being here. Thanks for all your questions. Travis, thanks for being here. John, thanks for being here. Anyone else who showed up and wasn't commenting, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And everybody else, continue to think deeply about God, Christianity, and Jesus, because they are worth thinking about. I will see you next week, for another conversation. Have a good one. Bye.